The sound that woke Marcus Sullivan from his restless sleep wasn't the usual cry of a coyote or the settling of his old mining cabin's wooden beams. It was something softer, more human and far more troubling in the pre-dawn darkness of the Arizona mountains. Mac had been prospecting silver in the shadow of the Superstition Mountains for 3 years, and he'd learned to distinguish between the sounds that meant danger and those that meant opportunity. This sound, barely audible above the December wind, meant something else entirely. Mac pulled on his boots and heavy coat, grabbed his rifle more from habit than fear, and stepped into the bitter cold that descended on the high desert each winter night. The temperature had dropped below freezing, unusual for Arizona, but not unheard of in the mountainous regions where Mac had chosen to make his solitary life. His breath formed clouds in the starlit air as he followed the sound around the corner of his cabin, where the woodpile provided some shelter from the cutting wind. What he found there made him forget the cold, the isolation and everything else, except the immediate need to preserve a human life. A young Native American girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, lay curled against his woodpile, her traditional clothing inadequate against the mountain cold. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow, and her dark eyes held the glassy look of someone dangerously close to freezing to death. Mac didn't hesitate or pause to wonder how she'd gotten there, or why she was alone in such a remote location. He scooped the girl up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, and carried her into the warmth of his cabin. The wood stove was still burning from the evening before, and Mac quickly added more logs to build up the fire, while wrapping the girl in every blanket he owned. She was conscious but barely responsive, murmuring words in what sounded like Apache as he worked to warm her hands and feet. Mac had learned enough of the language during his years as a cavalry scout to understand that she was saying something about watching and waiting. The girl gradually warmed and her breathing became more regular. Mac found himself studying her face and clothing for clues about where she might have come from. Her traditional dress was well made with intricate beadwork that suggested she came from a family of some importance within her tribe. But what struck him most was the lack of fear in her eyes when she finally focused on his face. Most native children in the territory had learned to be wary of white men, especially those living alone in the wilderness. But this girl looked at him with something that almost resembled recognition. Over the next several hours, as Mac fed her warm broth and gradually brought her body temperature back to normal, he began to notice details that troubled him more than the girl's initial condition. Her moccasins, while worn from travel, weren't damaged in the way he'd expect from someone who had wandered lost through the mountains. Her clothing, despite being inadequate for the cold, was clean and showed signs of recent care. Most puzzling of all, she seemed to know her way around his cabin, glancing toward the correct corners for things like the water bucket and the food stores without being shown. When the girl finally spoke clearly in English, her words confirmed Mac's growing suspicion that her presence at his cabin wasn't the result of accident or misfortune. "My name is Senna," she said, looking directly into his eyes with an intensity that seemed far older than her apparent age. "I was sent to you, Marcus Sullivan, because my people have been watching you for a very long time. They needed to know if you are the man they believe you to be." Mac sat back in his chair, studying the girl's serious expression and trying to process what she'd just revealed. He'd chosen this isolated location specifically to avoid the conflicts and complications that seemed to follow him wherever groups of people gathered. His reputation for fair dealing with native traders and his refusal to participate in the more brutal aspects of the Apache Wars had made him enemies among some settlers, but he'd never imagined that Apache leaders were keeping track of his actions or character. The implications of Senna's words settled over Mac like the mountain cold he'd just rescued her from. If Apache warriors had been watching his camp without his knowledge, it meant his isolation was an illusion, and his safety depended on the goodwill of people whose judgment of his character would determine not just his future, but possibly his survival in the unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory. As if reading his thoughts, Senna smiled for the first time since he'd found her, and said something that made Mac's blood run even colder than the December wind outside. "They are still watching, Marcus Sullivan. They have always been watching, and now the test begins." Over the next 3 days, as Senna recovered her strength, and Mac adjusted to having a companion in his previously solitary cabin, He began to notice signs that confirmed his growing awareness of being observed. Footprints in the snow that disappeared before he could follow them, the occasional glint of metal or movement among the rocks that surrounded his mining claim, and most unnervingly, the sense that every action he took was being evaluated by unseen judges who would determine his fate based on criteria he didn't fully understand. Senna proved to be an intelligent and observant companion, helping with cooking and cabin maintenance while sharing stories about her people that gave Mac insights into Apache culture he'd never gained during his years as a cavalry scout. She explained that her tribe's relationship with the white settlers wasn't simply one of constant warfare, as most territorial newspapers portrayed it, but rather a complex web of alliances, trading relationships, and carefully maintained neutrality agreements that allowed both groups to survive in the harsh Arizona landscape. What fascinated Mac most was learning about the Apache concept of character evaluation, a process that could take years, and involved observing how individuals behaved when they thought they were unobserved. Senna explained that her people had developed sophisticated methods for assessing the trustworthiness and wisdom of both Apache and non-Apache individuals, particularly those whose positions or actions could affect the welfare of entire communities. Mac's reputation for honest dealing and his refusal to participate in unprovoked attacks on native camps had brought him to the attention of tribal leaders who were facing unprecedented challenges in the changing territory. The test that Senna represented wasn't just about Mac's willingness to help a child in distress, though that compassion was certainly part of what they were evaluating. More importantly, they were assessing his ability to see beyond cultural differences, his patience in dealing with people whose ways he didn't fully understand, and his capacity for the kind of wisdom that could bridge the growing divide between Apache and settler communities. The fact that he had taken Senna in without question or demand for explanation had apparently satisfied the first phase of their evaluation, but, as Senna explained the broader context of her presence at his cabin, Mac began to understand that he was being considered for a role that would require far more than simple humanitarian impulses. Apache leaders were facing pressure from both aggressive settlers and their own warriors who favored armed resistance over negotiation. They needed someone who could serve as an intermediary, someone who understood both cultures well enough to facilitate communication, and who possessed the personal integrity to be trusted by both sides in increasingly dangerous situations. The scope of what they were asking him to consider became clear when Senna revealed that similar tests were being conducted with carefully selected individuals throughout the territory. The Apache leaders weren't just looking for one mediator, but rather a network of people who could help prevent the kind of total warfare that would devastate both communities. Mac's test was particularly important because his location in the Superstition Mountains gave him access to several different Apache bands, as well as the mining communities and small settlements that were expanding into traditional tribal territories. On the fourth day of Senna's stay, Mac's growing awareness of being watched was confirmed in a way that both relieved and troubled him. While checking his mining equipment near a creek about half a mile from his cabin, he caught sight of an Apache warrior observing him from a ridge above. Instead of hiding or disappearing when spotted, the warrior raised his hand in a gesture of acknowledgement before melting back into the landscape. The message was clear. The observation was deliberate, ongoing, and conducted by skilled individuals who could have remained completely hidden if they had chosen to do so. That evening, as Mac and Senna sat by the fire sharing a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, she told him something that would change his understanding of his own place in the complex social and political landscape of the Arizona Territory. The Apache leaders who had been watching him weren't just evaluating his character for their own purposes, but were part of a broader coalition that included leaders from other tribal groups, Mexican ranchers, and even some territorial officials who recognized that the current path toward total conflict would destroy everyone involved. The network they were trying to build would require individuals who could operate in the spaces between official policies and public positions, people who could facilitate the kind of practical cooperation that kept communities alive, while politicians and military commanders pursued strategies that often ignored the realities of life on the frontier. Mac's test was designed to determine whether he possessed not just the personal qualities necessary for such work, but also the courage to accept responsibilities that would make him a target for extremists on both sides of the cultural divide. As Senna prepared for sleep in the small alcove Mac had arranged for her, she left him with a question that would keep him awake long into the mountain night. "The watching will continue for as long as necessary, Marcus Sullivan, but the question my people need answered is not whether you can be trusted with their secrets, but whether you can be trusted with their hopes." The revelation of why Apache warriors had been watching Mac's isolated cabin came not from Senna's carefully measured words, but from an unexpected visitor who appeared at his door on the 5th morning after he'd found the girl freezing in the snow. The man who stood on Mac's threshold was clearly Apache, probably in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades navigating the dangerous currents of territorial politics. "I am Nalnish," the man said in careful English, "and I come to speak with the one who has shown kindness to my granddaughter." Mac's understanding of the situation shifted dramatically as he realized that Senna wasn't just any Apache child, but the granddaughter of what was clearly a significant tribal leader. The test he'd been subjected to wasn't a random evaluation, but a carefully orchestrated assessment designed by someone with the authority to make decisions that could affect the future of Apache settler relations throughout the region. Nalnish entered the cabin with the quiet dignity of someone who commanded respect without demanding it, acknowledging Senna with a gentle touch to her shoulder before settling into the chair across from Mac's position by the fire. The conversation that followed would give Mac his first complete understanding of the forces that had brought a freezing girl to his door and the expectations that now rested on his shoulders. The Apache leader explained that the territorial situation was far more complex and dangerous than most settlers understood. The U.S. military's increasingly aggressive policies toward native communities were creating pressure for a general uprising that would engulf the entire Southwest in warfare. At the same time, the growing number of mining operations and cattle ranches was making it impossible for Apache bands to maintain their traditional ways of life without coming into conflict with white economic interests. The window for finding peaceful solutions was closing rapidly, and leaders like Nalnish were looking for alternatives to the total war that seemed increasingly inevitable. Mac learned that his reputation among Apache communities extended far beyond his direct interactions with native traders and travelers. Stories of his fair dealing, his refusal to participate in unprovoked attacks, and his willingness to share water and supplies with anyone in genuine need had spread through the informal networks that connected Apache bands across the territory. More importantly, his behavior when he thought he was unobserved had been consistent with his public actions, a quality that Apache culture valued above almost all others. The test that Senna represented was the final phase of an evaluation that had been going on for nearly 2 years. Apache scouts had been observing Mac's daily routines, his treatment of animals, his response to unexpected challenges, and his behavior during the isolation and stress of winter prospecting. They had watched him share his supplies with hungry travelers, treat injured animals with care, and maintain his cabin and equipment with the kind of attention to detail that suggested respect for the tools and resources that sustained life in the wilderness. But Nalnish revealed that the evaluation process had a deeper purpose that went beyond assessing Mac's personal character. Apache oral traditions contained detailed knowledge about the Superstition Mountains that included information about mineral deposits, water sources, and seasonal weather patterns that could be invaluable to both Apache communities and white settlers trying to survive in the harsh landscape. The question facing tribal leaders was whether this knowledge could be shared selectively with individuals who would use it responsibly rather than exploit it for purely personal gain. Mac's mining claim, Nalnish explained, was located in an area that Apache people had used for centuries as a seasonal camp and source of materials for tools and weapons. The silver deposits that Mac had been working were part of a much larger network of mineral resources that tribal knowledge could help identify and develop in ways that would benefit both communities. But sharing such information would require a level of trust that could only be built through the kind of careful character assessment that had brought Senna to his cabin. The proposal that Nalnish outlined would transform Mac from a solitary prospector into something unprecedented in the Arizona Territory. A formal liaison between Apache communities and selected settler groups, someone who could facilitate the sharing of resources and knowledge while helping both sides avoid the misunderstandings and conflicts that were driving the region toward war. The role would require Mac to give up his isolation and accept responsibilities. That would make him a target for anyone who profited from conflict and misunderstanding. As the conversation continued through the morning, Mac began to understand that accepting Nalnish's proposal would mean becoming part of a network that extended far beyond the Superstition Mountains. Similar arrangements were being established throughout the Southwest, creating a web of relationships that could serve as an alternative to the official policies that seemed designed to make peaceful coexistence impossible. The work would be dangerous, often thankless, and would require skills in diplomacy and cultural translation that Mac had never imagined needing. But the most sobering aspect of what Nalnish was offering was the revelation that Mac's decision would be final and irrevocable. The knowledge that would be shared with him, the relationships that would be established, and the responsibilities that would be placed on his shoulders could never be abandoned without consequences that would extend far beyond his personal safety. The Apache leader was asking Mac to choose between the security of isolation and the risks of becoming a bridge between worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. As Nalnish prepared to leave, giving Mac time to consider a decision that would reshape his entire future, Sanaz approached her grandfather and spoke quietly in Apache. The elder man nodded and turned back to Mac with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "My granddaughter says you have already made your choice, Marcus Sullivan. She says the Watchers could see it in your actions long before you understood it yourself." Mac's acceptance of Nalnish's proposal came not through words, but through actions that demonstrated his commitment to the role of cultural liaison more clearly than any formal agreement could have. The transformation of his isolated mining cabin into a meeting place for Apache leaders and selected settler representatives began immediately, with Senna serving as both translator and cultural guide, as Mac learned to navigate the complex protocols that governed inter-tribal negotiations. The first formal gathering took place a week after Nalnish's visit, bringing together representatives from 3 different Apache bands, 2 Mexican ranchers, and the territorial agent responsible for native affairs in the region. Mac's cabin, which had been designed for solitary living, suddenly became a diplomatic center, where people who had been viewing each other as enemies discovered they shared common concerns about water rights, grazing territories, and the increasing presence of aggressive mining, operations that respected neither Apache sacred sites nor established ranching boundaries. What surprised Mac most about his new role was discovering how much Apache leaders already knew about the economic and political forces shaping the territory. Their information networks were far more sophisticated than anything the territorial government had established, providing detailed knowledge about railroad expansion plans, mining company financing, and the personal motivations of key officials whose decisions affected everyone trying to make a living in the Arizona landscape. The intelligence that Apache scouts had gathered through years of careful observation was proving invaluable to settlers who had been making decisions based on incomplete or deliberately misleading information. The success of the initial meetings led to the establishment of more formal arrangements that transformed Mac's mining operation into something unprecedented in the territorial economy. Using Apache knowledge of mineral deposits and water sources, combined with settler expertise in engineering and equipment, they developed mining techniques that were more efficient and less environmentally destructive than the methods typically employed by large commercial operations. The shared profits from these cooperative ventures provided funding for other projects that benefited both communities. But the most significant aspect of Mac's work as a cultural liaison was the development of communication protocols that allowed Apache and settler groups to resolve conflicts before they escalated into violence. The network that Nalnish had described was proving effective at preventing the kinds of misunderstandings that had historically led to cycles of retaliation and revenge. Mac found himself mediating disputes over everything from livestock theft to water rights, using his growing understanding of both cultures to find solutions that preserved the dignity and interests of all parties involved. The challenges of his new role became apparent when territorial officials began to question Mac's activities and his increasingly close relationships with Apache leaders. Some government representatives viewed any cooperation with native groups as potential treason, while certain military commanders saw the success of peaceful negotiations as a threat to their arguments for expanded military intervention. Mac discovered that building bridges between cultures meant accepting opposition from extremists on both sides who preferred conflict to the compromises necessary for coexistence. The situation became critical when a group of aggressive settlers, backed by a mining company that wanted access to Apache territories, began spreading rumors that Mac was providing weapons and intelligence to hostile tribes. The accusations were false, but they created political pressure that threatened to shut down the entire liaison network before it could prove its effectiveness. Mac realized that protecting the cooperative relationships he'd helped establish would require political skills and strategic thinking that went far beyond his experience as a prospector and cavalry scout. The solution came from an unexpected source when Senna, despite her youth, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of territorial politics and suggested a strategy that would use the settlers' own economic interests to counter the false accusations. She proposed that Mac organize a public demonstration of the cooperative mining techniques that had been developed through Apache settler collaboration, showing skeptical observers the practical benefits of peaceful cooperation while highlighting the superior results that could be achieved through shared knowledge and resources. The demonstration, held at Mac's mining claim with representatives from territorial newspapers and government offices in attendance, proved to be a turning point in public perception of the liaison network. The efficiency and profitability of the cooperative mining operation, combined with testimony from settler families who had benefited from Apache knowledge about water sources and seasonal weather patterns, created a compelling argument for the value of cultural cooperation over conflict. As winter turned to spring in the Superstition Mountains, Mac reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since the night he'd found a freezing Apache girl outside his cabin. What had begun as a simple act of humanitarian compassion had evolved into something that was reshaping relationships throughout the Arizona Territory. The watchers who had observed him for years had been correct in their assessment. He did possess the character and skills necessary to serve as a bridge between worlds that had too often seen each other as enemies. But Mac also understood that the success of the liaison network depended on continued vigilance and adaptation to changing circumstances. The forces that profited from conflict and misunderstanding hadn't disappeared, and maintaining peaceful cooperation would require ongoing commitment from individuals on both sides who were willing to risk their personal safety for the possibility of a better future for their communities. Standing outside his cabin on a clear spring morning, watching Senna teach Apache children and settler youngsters to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, Mac realized that the most important test hadn't been whether he could be trusted with Apache secrets, but whether he could help create a future where such secrets could be shared openly for the benefit of everyone trying to build lives in the challenging but beautiful landscape of the Arizona Territory. 1 year after Senna had first appeared at his cabin door, Mac Sullivan stood before a gathering that would have been impossible to imagine when he'd been living as a solitary prospector in the Superstition Mountains. The annual Harvest Festival, held in the valley below his mining claim, brought together Apache families, Mexican ranchers, territorial officials, and settler communities in a celebration that demonstrated how successfully the liaison network had transformed relationships throughout the region. The festival itself was a testament to the cultural exchange that had developed through Mac's work as a bridge between communities. Apache techniques for preserving food and predicting weather patterns were being shared alongside settler knowledge of farming and engineering. while Mexican traditions of craftsmanship and animal husbandry contributed to a growing economy that benefited everyone involved. The children who played together during the festival, including Senna, who had become a skilled translator and cultural teacher, represented a generation that might grow up seeing diversity as strength rather than threat. Mac's role had evolved far beyond what Nalnish had originally proposed, expanding to include coordination of trade agreements, resolution of territorial disputes, and facilitation of the kind of practical cooperation that kept communities alive during droughts, harsh winters, and other challenges that affected everyone regardless of their cultural background. The success of the liaison network had attracted attention from territorial capitals and federal officials who were beginning to recognize that peaceful cooperation was more effective than military intervention in maintaining stability on the frontier. The mining operation that had originally drawn Mac to the Superstition Mountains had become the foundation for a cooperative economy that was proving more profitable and sustainable than the exploitative practices typically employed by large commercial interests. Using Apache knowledge of geology and seasonal patterns, combined with settler engineering expertise and Mexican techniques for processing metals, they had developed methods that maximized yield while minimizing environmental damage. The shared profits supported schools, medical facilities, and infrastructure projects that served all the communities in the region. But perhaps the most significant achievement of the liaison network was the development of legal frameworks that recognized both Apache territorial rights and settler economic interests, creating a model for peaceful coexistence that was being studied by officials throughout the Southwest. The agreements that Mac had helped negotiate established clear boundaries for different types of land use while ensuring that all communities had access to the water, sources, and seasonal hunting grounds necessary for their survival. The challenges hadn't disappeared entirely, and Mac continued to face opposition from individuals and organizations that preferred the profits and simplicities of conflict to the complexities of cooperation. Some territorial officials still viewed any accommodation with native groups as weakness, while certain Apache factions remained suspicious of any agreements with white settlers. Maintaining the network required constant vigilance and adaptation to changing political and economic circumstances. The true test of what they had built came during a severe drought that threatened the entire region with famine and economic collapse. The cooperative relationships that had been established through the liaison network proved their worth as communities shared resources, knowledge, and labor to survive conditions that would have devastated isolated groups. Apache expertise in finding and conserving water sources, combined with settler techniques for irrigation and crop management, allowed the region to weather the crisis while other areas of the territory suffered significant losses. Senna, now 14, and serving as Mac's primary assistant in cultural translation and protocol, had become a symbol of the possibilities that cooperative relationships could create. Her education combined traditional Apache knowledge with settler skills in reading, writing, and mathematics, while her fluency in multiple languages made her invaluable in facilitating communication between different groups. She represented a new generation of cultural bridge builders who understood that preserving their heritage didn't require rejecting useful knowledge from other traditions. As Mac reflected on the year that had passed since Senna's arrival, he understood that the Apache warriors who had been watching him had been evaluating more than just his personal character. They had been assessing his potential to help create something unprecedented in the history of the American frontier, a model of intercultural cooperation that could serve as an alternative to the patterns of conquest and displacement that had characterized European expansion into native territories. The success of the liaison network had attracted attention from other regions where similar approaches were being attempted, creating a broader movement toward recognition that the future of the American West would depend on finding ways for different cultures to coexist and collaborate rather than compete for dominance. Mac's work in the Superstition Mountains had become part of a larger transformation in how people thought about cultural differences and shared resources. Standing at the edge of the Harvest Festival, watching Apache elders share stories with settler children while Mexican vaqueros demonstrated roping techniques to fascinated Apache youth, Mac understood that the most important harvest hadn't been the crops or minerals they had extracted from the Arizona landscape. The real harvest had been the trust that had grown between communities, that had learned to see each other as partners, rather than threats, and the knowledge that such cooperation was not only possible, but essential for everyone's survival, in the challenging and beautiful territory they all called home. The Watchers were still there, Mac knew, but now they watched with pride rather than suspicion. Guardians of a peace that had been built through patience, understanding, and the recognition that the true wealth of the Arizona Territory lay not in its silver deposits or grazing lands, but in the diversity of its people and the strength that came from their willingness to learn from each other.